Welcome back, regional security experts and geopolitical analysts, to this explainer on the emerging strategic fault lines in the Gulf. Specifically, we're zeroing in on the UAE's massive geopolitical realignment. We're unpacking a really comprehensive analysis from the Sunophiles Observatory today. And let me tell you, the strategic landscape of the Middle East is literally shifting right beneath our feet. We're moving way past those traditional, predictable alliances and straight into a highly complex, multidimensional chess game. So if you're tracking regional security, well, you are in the exact right place.
Okay, here is our roadmap for today's briefing. We'll cover 6 key areas. First, the UAE is the new frontline state. Second, competing maritime ambitions. Third, the energy strategy shift. Fourth, PR and diplomatic ruptures. Fifth, the Israeli strategic axis. And finally, visions for Gulf stability. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. The new frontline state.
You know, for years, the strategic posture in the Gulf was pretty uniform, right? It was mostly about collective security and measured deterrent. But that landscape really fractured in 2024 when the U.S. officially designated the UAE as a major defense partner. Now, step back a bit. After pulling out of Yemen, which a lot of us saw as a massive strategic reassessment, the UAE started carving out this really bold, independent path. And crucially, they've aggressively strengthened their defense ties with Israel. Actually, this specific integration, this tightening of ties with Israel and the U.S., is exactly what prompted Tehran to issue those recent escalatory threats. Iran is actively pointing to these new alliances to justify targeting Emirati territory. So by abandoning that traditional non-alignment posture, the UAE has effectively turned itself into an unanticipated frontline state in a much more volatile geopolitical theater.
Moving on to Section 2, competing maritime ambitions.
So, the UAE's maritime strategy is operating on this fascinating and, honestly, highly aggressive dual track. We aren't just talking about general trade or ideological proxy wars anymore. This is about hard infrastructure. On one hand, you have the overt pursuit of commercial dominance, projecting immense long-term influence across Somali ports and the broader Red Sea coastline. But paired directly with that, there's a hard power push for strategic military control over the Bab al-Mandab Strait. So, why does locking down one of the planet's most critical trade corridors matter so much right now? Well, regional analysts argue this dual approach serves a pretty massive, undeclared objective, constraining Saudi Arabia's future strategic mobility. By tightening its grip on these waterways, Abu Dhabi effectively boxes in its much larger neighbor, completely shifting the balance of maritime power away from traditional Saudi dominance. It's a textbook move to secure geopolitical leverage for decades to come.
Section 3. The energy strategy shift.
10 million. That is an absolutely staggering number. We're talking about Saudi Arabia's immense capability to produce roughly 10 million barrels of oil every single day, making them the undisputed anchor of the global energy market. So, how on earth does a smaller state challenge that kind of overwhelming economic gravity? Well, the UAE realized pretty quickly that they just couldn't compete within the traditional frameworks. So what did they do? They initiated this gradual, highly calculated distancing from organizations they felt were restricting their production freedom, specifically OPEC, OPEC+, and the Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries Organization. And to be clear, this is not your standard squabble over quarterly quotas. No, this is a profound geopolitical repositioning. Abu Dhabi decided that getting ultimate, independent production freedom was the necessary lever they needed to challenge Riyadh's economic pull and assert their own autonomous foreign policy globally. Of course, Saudi Arabia did not just sit back and remain silent. The traditional heavyweights immediately drew a line in the sand. Saudi Energy Minister Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman issued what is essentially a highly pointed, thinly veiled warning. He stated that anyone gambling within the energy sector would suffer severe pain. And adding to this friction, the Algerian president publicly dismissed the UAE's maneuvering, coming out and reaffirming Riyadh as the absolute essential pillar of OPEC. Now, for those of us who've been watching Gulf politics for a long time, this kind of public, sharp rebuke is a huge deal. It's a striking departure from the norm, right? It really underscores this fundamental evolution in diplomatic culture, where internal disagreements, stuff that used to be closely guarded secrets, are now just bleeding right out into public, high-stakes war-mints.
Which brings us to Section 4. PR and diplomatic ruptures.
So how are they executing this strategic divergence on the ground? It relies heavily on the aggressive weaponization of media. Back on April 28th, Abu Dhabi hosted this absolutely enormous media summit. They brought together nearly 1,000 influential Arab and Gulf figures. We're talking everyone from former state ministers to prominent digital bloggers. The sheer logistical and financial scale of this thing is wild, and it illustrates a highly sophisticated PR mobilization.
Basically, the UAE is actively utilizing public relations to shape regional political alignment, relentlessly hammering home their specific narrative on the Iran conflict. And their tactics? Remarkably aggressive. They openly criticize the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Arab League for being too cautious. They even reportedly warned that neighboring states hesitating to fully back the UAE could face future political consequences. It's a highly calculated, well-funded effort to isolate Saudi Arabia through sheer narrative dominance. And this media push has taken state rhetoric to levels we just haven't seen before. Pro-Emirati commentators have been deploying this really stark, contrasting imagery, literally labeling Saudi Arabia's traditional containment strategy as an ostrich burying its head in the sand, while framing the UAE as this independent, soaring falcon. This specific framing is a dramatic and frankly shocking rupture in traditional Gulf diplomatic culture. I mean, think about it. For decades, public criticism between neighboring Gulf states was strictly taboo. It was often legally punishable. Quiet, behind-closed-doors diplomacy was the absolute, unwritten rule that governed everything. But today, we're witnessing a complete rewrite of that diplomatic rulebook. They are entirely replacing private consensus building with public confrontation and explicit naming and shaming.
Section 5. The Israeli Strategic Axis.
At the heart of all this friction is a profound transformation. The true scope of this new strategic axis reveals a highly integrated, rapidly escalating partnership that completely upends historical precedent. First up, we're seeing the direct role of Israeli military support. Israel reportedly supplied missile defense systems to the UAE during recent tensions with Iran, a move that Emirati commentators openly praised as vital support from a genuine ally. Second, this normalization is physically spilling over into Yemen, with Emirati-backed factions signaling a strong, very public openness to Israel. Third, the UAE is being accused of actively facilitating strategic openings for Israeli influence in Somaliland. And finally, and this is perhaps the most critical point for global trade, reports are indicating active discussions about Israeli military facilities near the Bab al-Mandab Strait. For regional experts, the long-term concern here is abundantly clear. This isn't just about slapping down some temporary defensive systems anymore. It's about a deep, long-term penetration of Israeli military intelligence and influence embedding itself right into the fundamental security architecture of the Red Sea.
Finally, let's look at Section 6, Visions for Gulf Stability.
Ultimately, the very definition of stability is now heavily contested among the major powers in the region. You have the Emirati media narrative, which actively promotes Iranian regime collapse, framing it as a highly desirable and totally achievable strategic victory. But then, on the flip side, you have cautious states like Saudi Arabia. They deeply fear the uncontrollable chaos, the factional violence, and the massive border instability that such a collapse would almost certainly unleash across the broader Middle East. And compounding this specific Saudi fear is their deep anxiety regarding the long-term presence of Israeli military and political influence operating right in their geopolitical backyard under the banner of confronting Tehran. Guys, these are not just minor differences in policy execution. These are two fundamentally opposed views on how to ensure the very survival of the region.
So, the emerging fault line pits Saudi Arabia against the UAE across virtually every major category of statecraft. Saudi Arabia relies heavily on decades of cautious, containment-focused policy. They prioritize traditional Arab alliances, indirect communications channels, and quiet diplomacy, all aimed entirely at preventing sudden geopolitical shocks. In stark contrast, the UAE has fully embraced an assertive, expansionist foreign policy. They are powered by deep American and Israeli integration, they aren't afraid of open hostility toward adversaries, and they have a highly aggressive, mobilized public relations machine. We are way past tactical disagreements over shared regional goals here. What we're looking at are two completely incompatible, diverging blueprints for the future of the Middle East.
With the traditional Gulf diplomatic consensus completely fractured, escalating Iranian threats directly linked to these new alliances, and the embedding of long-term Israeli influence reshaping crucial maritime choke points, we have to leave you with this critical question. What actually happens when the major powers steering the Middle East no longer share a basic definition of what regional stability even looks like? Thank you so much for joining us for this political briefing. If you found this breakdown valuable, we kindly ask that you subscribe to our channel for more detailed explainers just like this one. Until next time, keep questioning the consensus.